Episode 9. The Heirs of Dagobert. Welcome back. Last time we discussed the career of Dagobert, and that for all his wisdom and pragmatic rule and attempts to circumvent his father's policy of making Maire du Palais a position for life, he was in some ways no better and no more intelligent than his predecessors, as Bunho's solution did not occur to him. Once again, the kingdoms were split between two heirs, Sigobert III and Clovis II. Now, neither of these rulers actually did much ruling, or were significant in any meaningful way, so the majority of our tale will revolve around a man by the name of Grimoald, who was the son of Pepin, is going to dominate the early part of this lecture. In 640, at the start of his independent career, after his father's death, he attempted to get himself nominated the Palace Maire for Sigobert. However, he was initially unsuccessful, as a rival noble by the name of Aton had managed to, after Pepin's death, get himself positioned as Maire du Palais in Austrasie. But this was only a temporary setback, for at that time, Thuringe rebelled against Sigobert, who along with Grimoald, Aton's co-maire, Duke Adalgisel, set out to quash the revolt. Things didn't go as planned though, as they were soundly defeated with Grimoald in the chaos saving the young king's life. In gratitude, he had Aton killed and had Grimoald promoted to his desired post. This effectively left Grimoald in control of the state, as Sigobert III was but a child. We must now turn to Sigobert's rival, if only for a moment. Clovis II was, if anything, even younger, and even more in the thrall of his mail for this reason. He did retain some form of independence and would in time, interestingly enough, wed an Anglo-Saxon slave by the name of Bathilde, who would go on to become a saintly figure, and was bought for this specific purpose in 649. She would bear him 3 sons, Clotal III, Childeric II, and Thierry III. I bring this up because by 652, Sigobert III would strangely enough have, according to recent discoveries, notably by the historian Matthias Seychelles, have his eldest son Childebert III adopted by Grimoald. Quite why this was done is a mystery. Perhaps Sigobert sought to avoid dividing up his realm. Or more than likely, Grimoald had thought of it and was preparing the way for the future. By the time of 656, Sigobert had one other son, one by the name of Dagobert, after his own father. Perhaps he realized the dangers of having 2 sons and was talked into removing one from the succession. However, what he could not have realized is that by adopting out his eldest in favor of his favorite, he was falling into a trap set by his right-hand man, who was now one step closer to the throne, because he had now become the father of the king, should Sigobert die, which could potentially place, by 7th century logic, Grimoald or his direct heirs in direct line for the throne. By now, he had largely outlived his usefulness. Now, with a son, this left Grimoald's son largely superfluous and a possible menace to the throne, as Palomaire had been almost 100 years prior, which is why one can hardly blame Grimoald and a group of nobles for deciding to rid themselves of the useless Sigobert. This accomplished, they now had the inconvenient problem of Dagobert, the son of Sigobert III. For this, there was a simple solution. Grimoald had him tonsured, thus removing him from the legitimate line, or so he, of succession, of succession, or so he thought, and then exiled to the wild west of Ireland. Surely now that he had eliminated the last barrier between his son, Childebert III, and the throne, he could now rest easy with power firmly set between his hands. It was not to be, though. As for all his political wit and subtlety, he was outmaneuvered a year later. In the meantime, while he had been securing the throne for his son, Elchinoald had been seizing power in the west, in Neustrie. He was a far cleverer man than Grimoald, whom invited the ambitious regent to a meeting only to have him assassinated. It is impossible to say what would have happened had Grimoald lived. If only he had survived, perhaps the Pepinid line might have risen sooner. Perhaps he would have indeed claimed the throne, but we will never know. With him dead, though, it did not clear the way for Elchinoald or Bathilde, the real power in Neustrie, alongside the Maire, in a trajectory towards power in Austrasie. They would have to wait only several years, though, as Childebert died in 662, with the 2 kingdoms of Neustrie and Austrasie going to Clotal III and Childeric II. Later, in 672, after Clotal died, the throne would go to his youngest brother, Thierry III. But more importantly than these kings who have been dubbed very aptly fainéants, or imbecilic kings, a reputation they have justly earned, despite many modern historians seeking to rescue them from this dustbin of history. Rather futilely, I think, when we can simply accept that, yes, the mayors and the aristocrats had become the real power, and were the ones contesting one another for control. And all the sources prove this. Why try to rescue imbeciles and needless figureheads? from just that reputation. The real contest of political power for the future of the kingdoms was between the pro-Bathilde candidate of Wulfoald, who was a rival to Grimoald, and his successors. Meanwhile, Dagobert would be recalled from Ireland, now a grown man and capable of ruling as he was in his 20s by the time of 676. However, he showed little aptitude and was killed whilst on a hunt 3 years later, clearing the way for Thierry to temporarily, technically reunify the kingdoms. While this was going on, though, the true power clearing the way for reunification was a group of nobles, led by Elchinoald's successor as Maire du Palais of Nestri, a brilliant and talented man by the name of Ebroin. A wealthy noble of the West, it was Ebroin who was in some ways the defining personality of the period between Dagobert and Pepin d'Herstal. It was he who effectively placed the second nail in the Merovingian dynasty's proverbial coffin. In order to understand Ebroin, we have to backtrack a little, back to 658. He was elevated to the rank of Maire du Palais, which effectively put him in control of Nestri. It would be him who was the true power behind the throne of the imbecilic kings in the West. A grasping and powerful figure, he had ambitions to rule not just one kingdom, but all of them. Sadly for him, he was also a man who had no compulsions about using darker methods to seize power. And via his counterpart in Austrasie, Wulfoald, he managed to, in time, offend the nobles over there as much as he did in Nestri. In 673, when he had managed to arrange for Thierry to mount the throne, he had offended the clergy and a great many other nobles led by the Bishop Leger, who took exception with the nobles of Burgundy never being consulted on who should be made king. With the southern nobles rebelling, the western ones barely in control, Ebroin's fine planning and moves to unify the realm seemed to have effectively blown up in his face. With Childeric's assassination in 675, he had been forced to flee, and after a short period of his puppet being removed from the throne, Ebroin soon had him back on the throne. This accomplished, with the support of Wulfoald, he defeated his enemies and recalled the wayward Bishop of Autun, Leger. It was at this time that he shocked contemporaries and likely his own puppet into turning against him, as he had the bishop's eyes removed and lips cut off. Several years later, in 678, he would have the man decapitated. Cruel, petty, and tyrannical. There was very little difference in a lot of ways between the Merovingian of old and Ebroin, except in one field. He was talented. Far more so than they had possibly ever been, but he was also changeable and not very popular. His enforcement of his favorites upon Austrasie and Burgundy angered them, and it wasn't long before Aquitaine was rumbling as well. It was a political powder keg, and it is doubtful the corrupt regent truly saw it, and merely a question of which kingdom would rebel first. The answer came when Ebroin tried to have, in 676, a man he named Clovis III placed on the throne of Austrasie. This was a move meant to take the wind out of their sails, as they had recently announced their decision to place Dagobert on the throne. This proved too much for them, as this Clovis, his most recent action though, proved to be too much for them, as this Clovis was no Merovingien, and therefore not of the royal line. Still, it seemed as though Ebroin would have his way, when in 679 he had Dagobert assassinated. In response, his right-hand man Wulfoald was assassinated a year later by a new man on the scene, a man possibly even more gifted than Ebroin himself, the heir to the Pepin and Arnulf lines. The death of Wulfoald should have been good news, because where he had been occasionally an ally and puppet, he had become increasingly opposed to Ebroin and his ambitions, having favored Dagobert as king instead of the false Merovingien Clovis III. Austrasie officially revolted and divided itself from Nestri under the leadership of Pepin d'Herstal, the nephew of Grimoald, through his sister Beg. A great battle was fought in 680 at La Toufau, near modern-day L'Alfaux, between Soissons and Laon, one which ended in Pepin's defeat, with the Maire of Austrasie forced back. This was an important lesson for him, as he soon learned that he could not defeat Ebroin in open combat. What was worst for Pepin was how his younger brother was handed over to Ebroin, who should have ransomed back the noble, but instead he had him brutally executed. This cemented the hatred between him and his rival, who would not rest now until he had returned the favor. The next major incident was when Thierry revolted, and so Clovis was all but forced on the Nestrian throne. Seeing how unpopular this was, though, Ebroin then reappointed Thierry as king. By now the title of king was all but meaningless, and by behaving in such a manner, having kings appointed as though they were his official, his attacks on the clergy, he had recently crossed a line with these two actions. The assassination, when it came, was decisive. It struck in 681 and was inflicted upon him by a disgruntled noble from the west. Interestingly, he immediately fled and was taken in by Pepin, who more than likely had arranged the whole affair. Brilliant and wealthy, it was very likely that Ibrahim could have unified the kingdoms, had he not been so open with his naked power, so cruel to allies and enemies alike, and been perhaps a tad less authoritarian. However, these vices had doomed him, just as his talents had raised him high. The next two Western males du Palais were not up to his standards, and would be defeated by the great man of the period. Join us next time, as we examine the history of and career of Pepin d'Herstal, the father of Charles Martel, and the one credited with the final demise in some ways of the Merovingian dynasty.